And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Sandra Peart. We talked a little bit about pronunciation, and I think I got it pretty
That was
close
good.
that time. Professor Peart is the Dean of the Jepson School of Entrepreneurial Studies at the University of Richmond, also Professor of Economics there. The way that most of us here at the center know her is as an historian of economic thought. I've known Sandy for many years, and what I knew her most for in the beginning was that she taught at the place that I got my degree at William and Mary, and then went on and started to run some summer institutes in the history of economic thought. We have a set of summer institutes here at Duke, many of them modeled very much after yours, and Sandy has gone on to be the president of the International Adam Smith Society, right, as well as the History of Economic Society. So definitely a person in the history of economic thought who is well known, well regarded. She has written or edited 11 books, I think, and my favorite, of course, is Hayek on Mill, which is part of the collected works of F.A. Hayek's series. So today you'll be talking about economists on progress, improvement, and social reform. So, Sandy,
Thank
great
you.
to have you here.
Thanks very much. Yes, so thanks for that introduction and also just for the invitation to talk here. It's wonderful to be here again. So I added a subtitle to the talk, to what end and how, and I think as I go along, the reason for the subtitle will become clear. Thanks for taking some time this evening. I know it's Halloween, and I told Bruce beforehand, I'm in a bit of trouble for not being at my house to give out candy, and so I really appreciate you being here. So in this talk, I want to take you through a fairly long arc of intellectual history as it relates to these elusive ideas of progress, improvement, and social reform. I think it's safe to say that many students come to economics initially as undergrads with dreams of making the world a better place. So when I was an undergrad, the thing I wanted to do was alleviate poverty, and that will actually be an important theme. Today it might be something related to global warming or solving immigration problems or whatever. Then we get into grad school, and at least in my case, and I think for others as well, sometimes you stop you're encouraged to drill really deeply into very narrow problems, and you kind of stop thinking about the bigger questions. And in my field, we sometimes got caught up in debates about David Ricardo's wages and what the word gold meant in the principles of political economy. And both those questions are kind of important. It's important to know whether wages are fixed or they respond to changes in patterns of final demand. But we sort of lost sight of the question by drilling into the word gold. And I want to start by just saying it wasn't always this way. In the period I want to talk to you about, roughly from kind of late 18th century through late 19th century, the big picture was constantly in the minds of the economists, people we would at least today call economists. There were, of course, lots of details, like whether circulating capital represents labor embodied or not, which were important. But the big questions, or bigger questions, were really at the forefront of what Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and William Stanley Jevons were writing about. And those are the three exemplars I'm going to use for today's talk. And the big question that they were often thinking about was how to alleviate what Jevons refers to in 1869 as the deep and almost hopeless poverty in the mass of people. He uses the word men. I'm just going to mostly, talk about people. So my goal today is to use those three exemplars, Smith, Mill, and Jevons, to argue that the view of progress changes in the roughly 100 years that I'm going to be looking at from the publication of Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776 to Jevons' Theory of Political Economy, and some follow-on works in 1870, Theory of Political Economy, and then some other works in 1880 and so on. And the view of how improvement was to occur also changed. In short, sort of spoiler alert, here's what I'm going to try to argue. I'm going to try to convince you that economists moved from a focus on happiness and well-being to a focus on welfare, even at the possible expense of happiness. And then late in the 19th century, they began to take a more prominent role in specifying how welfare was to be improved. So, my first question is, what is progress? And I think Jevons' description or statement from 1869 gives us a clue to the answer of that. Progress at this time, and this is fairly common throughout the 100 years, is about alleviating poverty. One technical point relating to Smith is that he makes it clear that progress is not about creating more wealth that goes to the top of the income distribution. It's not simply about raising average income, but instead it's very much about raising the standard of living for the poorest of the poor. So here's what Smith says. This is from his Wealth of Nations. Is this improvement, and he's talking about improvement, higher wages, increased wages, in the circumstances of the lower ranks of the people to be regarded as an advantage or an inconveniency to the society? The answer seems at first sight abundantly plain. Servants, laborers, and workmen make up workmen of different kinds make up the far greater part, the majority, the large majority of every great political society. What improves the circumstances of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconvenience to the whole. No society can be truly flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. Progress for Smith is marked by flourishing and by happiness. And necessary, although it's not sufficient, condition of progress is the eradication of poverty. Progress occurs through growth, which as he puts it, is best for the laboring poor. Growth facilitates an increase in wages, and it allows for people to have families that don't perish. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about, just the extreme precariousness of life at this time. So it's not the size of GDP, roughly speaking, that makes for progress, but rather its growth, which occasions a rise in the wages of labor. Smith compares North America, where labor is scarce and wages are both high and increasing, with England, a richer country, larger overall GDP, but where wages are relatively stagnant. He uses three very interesting words to talk about this: cheerful, dull, and melancholy. Progress is marked by cheerful people. He writes that the progressive state is in reality the cheerful and the hearty state to all the different orders of society. The stationary state is dull, the declining melancholy. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to emphasize an important characteristic of his analysis of all of us, or all of the people who lived in his society, because it's going to be important as I go through the talk and talk about especially John Stuart Mill and Jevons. He emphasizes, and some of you may know this from reading some of my work with David Levy, that we're all naturally equal, although we're not in equal settings. We're in very different, unequal settings. We're born into different parts of society. He calls them the ranks of society. And we rarely move from one rank to another. It's a very big change that just doesn't happen very often, at least in his day. But if we could be parachuted from being the laboring class into being a philosopher or being a king or a member of the royal family, we at least eventually we would do all right. Because we're equally capable, at least with some learning, some experience, and some education. Education, learning by doing, it would be if you do a parachute sort of experiment. Smith famously wrote about how the street porter, one of roughly 5,000 people in his day, 1776, who carried things for other people. And by things, I mean, not simply my backpack, but 50 pounds on one's back or more. So 5,000 porters who live in London at the time and whose occupation was, as I say, to carry things about. He very famously compares them to the lofty philosopher and says that essentially they're the same. Of course, he's writing in a time when the economy is about to be thrown into flux. A pre-industrial time when life-threatening poverty prevailed for large numbers of the population. Estimates of caloric intake by economic historians vary, but they do suggest that a significant portion of the British population had diets below what was necessary to maintain weight. Portering was, as I said earlier, very much hard work. And one estimate is that those manual laborers consumed about 2,000 calories from beer, stopping at local pubs in between, dropping off a load and getting the next load, to fill up and, to just have the caloric intake that was necessary for that sort of job. Evidence also suggests that households compensated for a dearth of calories. So if the harvest was poor or whatever, and there just wasn't so much food being produced, that they would shift the share of calories from the women and children in families to the male workers within families in such a way that when these catastrophic events, output fluctuations occurred, crisis mortality occurred. So Smith's words cheerful and melancholy are indications of real success and abject misery. Life was precarious. And one of the most important indications of how precarious life was, depicted in this slide, is the Great Irish Famine that takes place a few generations after Smith is writing. This singularly important event shapes much thinking about progress and improvement in the mid-19th century. The famine was a period of mass starvation and disease that absolutely devastated Ireland, with much of its population, very significant portion of its population, either starving or departing from the island. Such a massive relocation, 2 million people, weighed heavily on the minds of economists, people we would today call economists, at mid-19th century. They asked what went wrong and how such a crisis could be averted in the future. As that question was debated, economists and others arrayed themselves on two sides. Those who said the problem was mainly with the Irish, and those who faulted the arrangements governing Ireland. Both sides of the debate wanted progress, but they differed on how best to achieve it. In the course of the debate, some intellectuals questioned Smith's proposition of natural equality. And they did so in the context of the debates over the Irish famine, but also then debates about the British abolition of slave trade. And while those seem to be two very different topics, they're connected by the question of the issue of natural equality. In the debates, Mill represented the Smithian side of natural equality. He wrote that people, laborers and capitalists and landowners, are similarly motivated to obtain gain, material or otherwise, at the lowest possible cost. More than this, he recognized that there are other cultures, and he names France and Ireland in this context, that are similarly motivated. Consequently, differences in outcome are not the result of systematic differences. Instead, they result from differential circumstances, what David Levy and I have referred to as luck, experience, and history, including educational attainment. Mill's clearest statements about this come from his 1836 essay on the definition of political economy, where he called for a separate, but as he put it, inexact science that treats economic behavior in a social context. There he developed an arbitrary definition of economic people while recognizing the complexity of motivations that are at work on us. He suggests that most of these are unimportant for the study of economic phenomena. Maximizing, choosing, economizing, obtaining wealth, becoming happy, these were central. Other motivations were less significant and might be ignored without doing harm to the study at hand. Mill wrote that people invariably do what is required to, quote, obtain the greatest amount of necessaries, conveniences, and luxuries with the smallest quantity of labor and physical self-denial with which they can be obtained in the existing state of knowledge. This is the origin, then, of Mill's abstract economic person, and arguably the sometimes maligned homo economicus that we rely on in economics. It's important to keep in mind that the context in which Mill develops this idea, as some people were holding that neither the Irish nor women nor formerly enslaved people could become capable of voting or self-governance. Mill counters that, abstracting from experience and luck. They're the same. They're equally capable. This is where then this very thin notion of human nature enters into economics. Figuni-Scheff has written about this and calls it, a very thin notion. It's been, widely criticized. But as I say, it's important to keep in mind the context in which Mill develops the idea. Mill did not want to allow for national, gendered, or ethnic natural differences in economic or political activity. He knew that differences in outcomes existed, vast differences, but he wanted to make the case that, for instance, the Irish could be as effective at making decisions as the English, if only their circumstances were the same. This contrast between circumstances versus natural inclinations is a major theme in Mill's work, both in the Principles of Political Economy, but also in many of his pieces on Ireland and on women, pieces he wrote with Harriet Taylor Mill, and so on. Coming back to the famine, responding to the enormous suffering caused by the Irish famine, some writers of the time question whether Ireland and Irish laborers were doomed to economic stagnation and poverty, whether there could be progress among people who were Irish. They blame the poverty of the Irish laborers on their so-called natural inclinations to be lazy, and they developed measures that would tie the Irish to formerly enslaved persons, to West Africans. Mill vehemently, so they devised an index which was to say how close an Irish was to a West African, an Irish person. Mill vehemently rejects that supposed explanation for the Irish famine and their aftermath. Low productivity in Ireland, he writes, was not a matter of natural Irish inclination to indolence. So this is from his Principles. He writes, is it not then a bitter satire on the mode in which opinions are formed to find public instructors of the greatest pretensions, so public intellectuals, imputing the backwardness of Irish industry and the want of energy in the Irish people in improving their condition to a peculiar indolence and insouciance in the Celtic race. Of all vulgar modes of escaping from the consideration of the effect of social and moral influences on the human mind, the most vulgar, he says, is that of attributing the diversities of conduct and character to inherent natural differences. So he instead imputes Ireland's difficulties to the long-standing arrangements that denied to the Irish the fruits of their labor. People will not, again, work very hard unless they're rewarded, well rewarded. Mill targeted landed property that assigned rights to absent landowners and left the laboring poor in wretched conditions of poverty in Ireland. Remember, he publishes the first edition of the Principles just as hundreds of thousands of Irish peasants were starving, succumbing to disease, or fleeing Ireland in the wake of the Irish potato blight and famine. As a means to improvement, Mill recommends that Irish cottiers be converted to peasant proprietors through what would have amounted to a massive land redistribution with compensation. An interesting additional point. It's important to keep in mind just how radical his position on Ireland and Irish peasants was. On the other side of this, political economists such as W.R. Gregg, and there are many others, but he's a good foil to Mill, attacked Mill's position and suggested that the Irish were inherently indolent. Any attempt to change the distribution of income in Ireland through newly established or differently established property rights, Gregg argued, would fail. Make them peasant proprietors, says Mr. Mill, Gregg writes. But Mr. Mill forgets that till you change the character of the Irish cottiers, you actually have to change who they are. Peasant proprietorship would work no miracle. Now he means the peasant, would fall behind in the installments of his purchase money and would be called upon to surrender his farm. He would often neglect it, and these 4 words are very important, as is the word death. In idleness, ignorance, jollity, and drink. Those are 4 code words for people who are inferior. They're too jolly, they're ignorant, and they're unwilling to learn. They drink too much, they can't save, and the next sentence goes on to that. The rest of the sentence, get into debt and have to sell his property to the nearest owner of a great estate. He even has a time period in which this failed policy will totally fall apart. In 2 generations, Ireland would again be England's difficulty, come back upon her in aggravated form. So I was thinking about this afternoon. I'm not sure why he says aggravated form, but it's going to be just as bad. But no, he actually thinks it'll come back to be even worse. Gregg argued that the Irish would never work hard or become productive. They would be forever, as the phrase at the time suggests, the English laborer's burden. That argument had real currency for those who lived in England. It's a rhetorical device that he's using. In this context, the question was whether Ireland would remain the burden of England, with the poor working folk in England bearing the brunt of the problem and suffering as a result. Meanwhile, in Ireland, agitation focused on obtaining a better lot for the Irish peasant. Of course, in addition to ongoing discussions regarding the causes of the Irish famine, the debates at this time focused on racial characteristics, so-called racial characteristics, in the context of improvement. And here too, Gregg enters the fray, arguing that some groups, the Irish, West African former slaves, First Peoples, so Native Americans, were naturally indolent and supposedly inferior decision makers. Mill opposed that view and suggested by contrast that what might look like observed indolence was simply a result, for instance, in Jamaica, the colony of Jamaica, was simply a result of wages that were too low. wages that are below one's reservation wage. After the 1865 rebellion in Morant Bay, in which a British governor, Edward John Eyre, facilitated the murder of more than 400 formerly enslaved people, it was Mill who was elected to serve as the head of the group that sought to punish Governor Eyre for his brutal attacks. This event is now known as the Governor Eyre controversy. Cartoons at the time in Punch magazine and other venues link Mill to the Eyre controversy to the Irish, and as a warning to the Irish. So here's a cartoon with a Fenian rebel who's drawn with very commonly used characteristics of the time. So John Tenniel, who's the principal artist for Punch, draws Irish people to look like that, as I say, almost all the time at this time. So this is 1865, and the caption says "Rebellion." I am going to walk a little bit. This is his mark, John Tenniel, his initials. The caption says it's John Bull, kicking this rebel out, and says, it says rebellion had bad luck. John Bull says, "There, get out. Don't let me see your ugly face again for 20 years. And thank your stars you were stopped in time." Because had you not been stopped in time, we would have treated you the way John Eyre treated people in Jamaica. And how do I know it's connected to Jamaica? He's got a rolled up newspaper in his right hand that has the headline, Jamaica. So all of these things are being connected. So I've dwelled on the issue of natural equality versus circumstances because it's critically important to Mill's notion and that of Smith of how to obtain progress. If you think that people are incapable of making economic or political decisions, you would advocate for different steps to achieve progress than if you think they're capable. This is an ongoing theme of the 19th and early 20th centuries. What I haven't quite tackled yet is, what is progress for John Stuart Mill? Does the notion of progress alter, and if so, why, only a few generations after Adam Smith? I think the notion that there are some similarities, but there is a shift in Mill's view of progress. So it's somewhat different from that of Smith. And I would suggest that it has to do with the coming of industrialization and the problem of what I mentioned earlier, that deep and very hopeless poverty that became exacerbated and led Mill to look a little differently at progress. Economic historians have looked into the issue of what happened to the standard of living, whether it eroded during the early years of industrialization. For Mill, those early years of industrialization were not marked by clear signs of progress. He looked forward to a time of less roughshod competition and when people would be able to afford to marry and have children who survived and so on. In fact, Mill's idea of progress is more capacious than simply the improved production of stuff, physical stuff. And in that, I think he is like Adam Smith. But for Mill, progress is attained when people are happier, and happiness arises from all sorts of activities, not simply the consumption of the amount of stuff that we need in order to stay alive. Mill is no apologist for the status quo of 19th century capitalism. He worried a great deal about what he called the disagreeable symptoms of 19th century industrial life. In his famous chapter on the stationary state, he decried what he called the, quote, trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other's heels, which form the existing type of social life. Perhaps naively, but maybe not actually, he looked forward to a new phase of industrial life in which economic growth slowed, perhaps stopped, in the stationary state. And instead of the art of getting on, people would have additional room for what he called the art of living. Stationarity for him can be economic, but human flourishing, which entails more than simply, physical stuff that we consume, more than monetary earnings, can improve in an economically stationary state. By contrast, for Gregg and others who are on his side of this debate later in the 19th century, progress is obtained by increasing welfare. And for Gregg and others like him, I'm just kind of using him as a foil, welfare becomes uncoupled from happiness and instead is tied to the supposed quality of the inhabitants in a society. If the quality of the people deteriorates, for instance, when more births are drawn from the lower ranks of quality and fewer from the higher quality ranks, then according to these critics of the happiness notion, there's lack of progress or negative progress or retrogression. Anyone here read the lovely children's tale, The Water Babies? Which is a terrifying tale. Charles Kingsley's Water Babies, which was an extremely popular children's tale written in 1862 and 3 for Macmillan's magazine, provides terrifying stories of how such devolution occurs. Such commentators, again as Gregg or Kingsley or whatever, also took the step to suggest that something needed to be done to correct for such drift, even if it meant making supposedly lower quality people miserable, less happy. In a few minutes, I'll talk about how Gregg ties into a nasty, and I'm only going to briefly touch on it, portion of economic and social thought, how to improve the race via eugenics or immigration restrictions. Before I do that, I want to tackle the question of social reform. And I want to suggest next that these different approaches also tied into the question of how a society is to be improved or improve. Simply put, one can imagine that a group improves as each of its members improves, a sort of bottom-up approach, where you and I and a bunch of other people individually decide what improvement means for each of us, and we try to attain it. So I think I'm a better person if I run more than 20 miles a week. You think you're a better person if you can play a Beethoven sonata. We each succeed, or at least try to succeed, or partially succeed in attaining the goal, and collectively we improve as each of us attains those goals of improvement. And improvement writ large is facilitated by whatever social reforms are needed to enable us to pursue and achieve our goals. If I'm not allowed to run, or we're not offered the access to education that is needed for us to make our choices regarding improvement and allow us to pursue those goals, social reforms are needed to remove those barriers and provide access. This is the sort of improvement that John Stuart Mill wrote about and endorsed. And this is Mill with Harriet Taylor, the woman who was with whom he had a long-standing friendship and then eventually married. Mill endorsed, and sort of Taylor, but I'm mostly talking about Mill, and spent his life advocating for a series of extremely important reforms that he thought would allow people and society to improve. It's just that he advocated for reforms that placed us all on an equal level, as he put it, able to start fair in the race of life. Sometimes those reforms were legal to assure impartial treatment, for instance, of men and women. In this case, the state was to correct a long-standing wrong that it had perpetuated or placed into law centuries earlier. Alternatively, or in addition, he called on the state to provide positive benefits, so not just to remove barriers, but provide positive benefits to previously excluded groups, such as women. In his view and that of Harriet, pictured here, women who were uneducated were unable to improve. More than 30 years before the publication of the Subjection of Women, which he wrote with Harriet, Mill railed against the custom of educated women for and only for marriage. The manuscript to the right, which is difficult to read, although his handwriting was fairly better than some to read. In that's from the essay that he wrote to Harriet sometime around 1831 or 1832. And he writes, "Women are so brought up as not to be able to subsist in a mere physical sense without a man to keep them. They're so brought up as not to be able to protect themselves against injury or insult without some man on whom they have a special claim to protect them. They are so brought up as to have no vocation or useful office to fulfill in the world, remaining single. For all women who are educated for anything except to get married are educated to be married. And what little they are taught deserving the name of useful is chiefly what in the ordinary course of things will not come into actual use unless nor until they are married." All this he attributes to the state of marriage laws in his time. Keeping in mind his notion that one learns to choose prudently by experiencing a life filled with choices, in his view, these arrangements impose substantial costs on society. Thus, Mill questioned legal arrangements that place groups on different footings in terms of their ability to develop the capacity to choose and to be happy. Marriage laws in his time were one area ripe for reform. The legal state of women, as he and Harriet Taylor put it in their 1869 Subjection of Women, left women dependent on the good graces of their husbands. While sometimes this worked out, often it did not. And since women who were allowed to choose, often their marriages were arranged, but sometimes they chose, but they frequently did so at a very young age, with little to no education or experience in making choices of any sort, let alone one of such importance. And Mill and Harriet then opined that it was no surprise that women frequently got the choice badly wrong. Mill paid both professionally and personally for his radical views on women, as this image suggests. So this is from Judy, which is a slightly more lowbrow magazine than Punch. Mill was not only targeted in the press, but his originality and his intellectual prowess have been questioned, for one, by Friedrich Hayek and many others, by some who think that he was overly bowled over by his relationship with Harriet Taylor. The one reason I quoted from the 31-32 essay is that he didn't know Harriet at that point. I mean, he knew her, but he didn't. It's not like he had spent time writing with her or whatever. And at that point, he professes views that are very much the same sort of views that show up in their 1869 Subjection of Women. More than this, his arrangement, very unusual arrangement with Harriet, where the two traveled together while she was a married woman, while her husband was still alive, came at great personal cost to John Stuart Mill. It left him estranged from his friends. He's a very social person, intellectually connected to anyone who's of any importance in mid-19th century thought, who then shunned him, but also his family. And if you read the correspondence from his sister to Mill, basically she says, this will close all interaction that we will have. You've made this choice to be with Taylor, and we'll never speak again. It's heart-wrenching. Returning to their views on women, Mill and Taylor held that since women couldn't own property outside of marriage, they had no means to support themselves and no recourse to exit a marriage. Such an imbalance of legal, economic, and physical power left a woman in a position, as they put it, of slavery as to her own person. In the extreme case, women were subject to physical abuse, including marital rape. To write about something like that in 1869 was just so far advanced relative to their time. Even worse, there was no way for women legally to remove children from an abusive relationship. Nothing short of equality under the law would suffice for Mill. Those women who were fortunate enough to bring property into the marriage and the few who were able to earn property throughout the marriage were to have access to it if the marriage dissolved. Mill was hopeful on balance on these points, pointing to legal arrangements in several states in America that secured to women the right to own property independent of marital status. Mill also called for reform of social arrangements so that women would have access to education to the same extent as men. Over the course of his very long career, he vigorously opposed the custom that he alluded to in the former slide of educating women only to be wives, and wanted to see women offered the same educational and labor market opportunities as men. Mill held that women were not only fit to vote, that in itself is controversial in mid-19th century, but also they were fit to hold office, he thought. As a result of those reforms, Mill anticipated greater labor force participation rates among women. And he also anticipated that there would be a decline in population growth as a result of their entering the labor force in larger percentages. Present arrangements in his time left women with no say in the family size decision, he argued, and led to severe poverty. One is reminded here of Mill's own family arrangement where he was one of 9 children born in about as many years, and he refers in the autobiography to his mother essentially being a sort of drudge who had no time for anything except raising the children. A contrasting, so now I'm going to move to Jevons, a contrasting notion of improvement in social reform, however, is to impose it from the top, to define what a good set of choices is, or a good set of individuals is, and then to try to impose that on the collective whole. And here I would point to William Stanley Jevons as an interesting precursor to some of the more modern folks of this ilk in the 20th century. In his Theory of Political Economy of 1870, Jevons recognized that consumers did not actually fulfill his utility maximization conditions, and he outlined a key reason for this. People make systematic mistakes. In his view, especially poor people make systematic mistakes. They systematically undersave, they marry poorly, they overwork, they underinvest in education, and they acquired what he thought of as inferior tastes. These were situations that warranted a wide array of policy interventions to move people closer to his all-knowing consumers. In contrast with Mill's emphasis on learning, and I want to run more than 20 miles this week, and I say I'm going to do it, but then I forget that I'm coming to Duke and I won't be able to run today, and so next week I'll learn to look at my calendar and I'll make my goal based on how many nights I have to work and whatever. So Mill kind of emphasizes this learning and redoing our goals and revising and remaking ourselves. There's no evidence, or I guess I would say little evidence, to indicate Jevons believed people are motivated to find ways to improve themselves. For Jevons, time, and this is true of the debate throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, time is a cause of systematic error. His disapproval of the intertemporal consumption choices by the laboring classes is particularly striking. Unlike Mill, Jevons was not sanguine, as I just said, about whether people will learn through their mistakes and correct their choices over time. Instead, in a series of essays, he insisted that policies be developed to reduce ignorance and improve people morally, to kind of remake people, if you want to think of it that way. Rather than us remaking ourselves, these would help people remake themselves. Roughly speaking, the 2 areas for intervention corresponded to improving the lot of the poor by helping them see into the future, and then giving them the needed willpower to hold off spending too much in the present. The phrase at the time, this is not Jevons' phrase, but telepathic telescopic sort of ability to see into the future is sort of closed off to those who are poor, and Jevons wants that to be improved. By beseeching, as he put it, the citadel of poverty and ignorance and vice, those three things are linked in his mind. Jevons recommends a series of interventions to improve the lot of the poor in both dimensions. In his view, for instance, poor women, so this is very unlike Mill, poor women are prone to marrying the wrong sort of persons and working in factories and then harming their children as a result of that. And that's the sort of systematic error that Jevons thinks requires a policy, an important policy intervention. Along similar lines in his theory of political economy, he talks about a policy solution to poor tastes, inferior tastes. A gamester, someone who likes to gamble, is, as he put it, so devoid of taste that to spend money over the gaming table is the best use he can discover for it. So tisk, tisk, you gambler. Economically speaking, there's nothing further to be said. So it's a policy matter. The question, he writes, he goes on, becomes a moral, legislative, or political one. Jevons' thinking about remaking his subjects is further evident in his 1869 inaugural address to the Manchester Statistical Society, of which he's president. There, and that's where he talks about the deep and almost hopeless poverty. There he links the persistence of that poverty to the habits of the people. His preoccupation with intemperance and low rates of savings is again evident. He emphasizes the need to reduce ignorance, but also to improve morals, improve their provident habits. He insists that improving the standard of living of the laboring classes would have no lasting impact, and here he sounds like W.R. Gregg, like no lasting impact unless accompanied by a change in character. General education is something that kind of gets close to being a panacea, but it's not a panacea. It's not sufficient in his view. In a series of articles published in the late 70s and until his death in 1882, Jevons spelled out his plan to besiege that citadel of poverty. Taken together, these articles reveal that he has a vast remaking of people in mind. His 1878 Amusements of the People essay points to the general low tone of popular manners among the laboring classes and recommends a broad type of education to cultivate improved tastes and change the character of the laboring classes. Cultivating a higher tone of recreation through legislative means and moral suasion comprises the principal means toward a higher civilization by improving the character of the laboring classes. And Methods of Social Reform, which is a collection of essays published posthumously by his wife, is replete with examples of how he intended to improve the character of the laboring classes using these kinds of interventions. An even more telling step towards social reform, and one that I want to hasten Jevons did not take, is that of supposedly breeding out poor characteristics and breeding in good characteristics. That is eugenics. And here, intellectuals from many disciplines, including economics, jumped on the notion of this sort of improvement. And thus begins what I think is, as I say, a really nasty episode in the history of thought, intellectual thought, history of improvement thought. I don't think it warrants a lot of retelling here. The work that Tim Leonard has done, Annie Kotz has done, and some work that David and Levy and I have done talks about that. But what I would emphasize is that two things precede this move. First, a separation a la Gregg, who's the co-founder of eugenics, a la Gregg, of the Smithian and Millian notion of human happiness, the separation of happiness from welfare. is an important precursor. And second, the presumption of knowing more about the subject than the subject himself knows. And so once those two arguments have been accepted by some intellectuals, then it's not a huge step to move into immigration restrictions or eugenic, supposedly, reforms. And here's an example, again from Punch, of that takes the argument into immigration, untaxed imports. And the group being targeted changes decade to decade. These are Italians who are coming in freely, and they have the audacity to be happy. So the connection to happiness is important. I'm almost done. I would just add that, unfortunately, some of these ideas are still in common discourse today. So some conclusions. This is a Hayek lecture, and it seems appropriate then, at least in conclusion, to mention Friedrich Hayek. Those of you who are familiar with Hayek may recall that in The Road to Serfdom, he challenges the idea of a top-down social reform. And he does so on grounds that relate to the foregoing discussion of happiness versus improvement. Hayek argues that it's not feasible to ascertain a single goal for social reform, welfare. Indeed, any attempt to implement a unitary goal must override the hopes and happiness of some to obtain that goal. The welfare and happiness of millions, he says, cannot be measured on a single scale of less and more. The welfare of a people, like the happiness of a person, depends on a great many things that can be provided in an infinite variety of combinations. It cannot be adequately expressed as a single end, but only as a hierarchy of ends, as a comprehensive scale of values in which every need of every person is given its place. Well, it's no coincidence that Hayek's criticism is very similar to that of John Stuart Mill, written over 100 years before Hayek. Mill's criticism of the socialist schemes, in particular the scheme of Auguste Comte, but also Charles Fourier and Saint-Simon. Hayek was familiar, obviously, with Mill's position, and he noted that Mill recognized one of the most vulnerable spots in Comte's political doctrines. Supposing the government was to direct all the forces of society toward some one end, how is society or the government to settle on one single end for all? Indeed, Mill writes, and this is in 1829, he writes to Gustave Dictal, who's a Saint-Simonian, and with whom he corresponded for over a long period of time. The united forces, I want to see where I started this quote, the united forces of society never were, nor can be directed toward one single end, nor is there, so far as I can perceive, any reason for desiring that they should. Men do not come into the world to fulfill one single end, which, if fulfilled, even in the most complete manner, would make them happy. Oh, sorry, I left out a little phrase. And there is no single end, which, if fulfilled. No. It warrants emphasizing that those like Smith, Mill, and Hayek, and others, who take that bottom-up approach have a fundamentally different view as to the potential role of the economist as policy advisor. For Jevons and Gregg and others in this approach, and I'm not trying to say that Jevons is equivalent to Gregg, they're quite different, but similar in some respects. The economist tells people how to behave and how best to improve themselves. By contrast, for Smith and Mill, the economist plays a more modest role of offering suggestions to ensure that all persons have the requisite means to choose how best to improve themselves. Progress results then when people improve themselves, and the role of the state is largely to remove impediments to such efforts. I'll leave it to you to decide which approach is more appropriate for today. So with that, I'll take comments, questions, whatever. Thank you. Okay, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Curious about the difference in and how Mill versus Jevons thought about education and access to education. And so I was wondering if there were specific pedagogical differences that reflected their different attitudes towards. So, because it seems like one contrast is like, well, one is make education available, but the other one is to actually, have control over what the syllabi look like. So I was curious, like, what the pedagogical differences were.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So first, both are in favor of more education. And Mill writes, a lot about speech and discussion and learning through kind of argumentation and so on. So his notion of the the nature of education is one in which there's lots of different opinions voiced, and one learns. Earlier this morning in Bruce's class, I talked about bad advice. One learns to distinguish between good and bad advice or good and bad arguments through the experience of having arguments. And he writes this piece when he becomes the rector of St. Andrews about the nature of education. And it's very much the curriculum that he talks about is very much kind of geared in that way. Jevons has an interesting piece. Neither of them writes a lot about the content of education, but he has an interesting piece called Cram, in which he writes about how important it is for people to study for exams and learn the curriculum and be able to then feed the curriculum back on an exam paper. So it suggests, I don't want to make too much out of it, but it suggests a slightly different kind of notion of education. More than a slightly, it suggests a very different notion of education. As I said, I don't want to make, suggest that like Jevons doesn't think there should be that he thinks there should be no argumentation or whatever, but he does have this idea that, there should be a set curriculum and students should have to learn that curriculum, and it should be painful. Right? So Cram, he likes Cram. He likes the fact that it's painful, and his whole life is kind of, he sort of lived that. He would closet himself, have these periods of time when he would, just write, and so on, and overwork himself, and so on. So I find it a little odd that he doesn't have that much room for people to improve themselves, because he was constantly trying to improve himself. It seems a little self-contradictory. But the point about education, I think, is really important. So thanks.
Yeah.
So, how did John Stuart Mill come up with these crazy ideas of his time? So it was because of the Scottish Enlightenment that was about skepticism vis-a-vis established institutions, was because of Darwin and his theory of evolution, or for his education?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I can really say for certain that I know what generated his ideas, but I will say there's his personal experience. So this in the class this morning on Mill, I talked about the tyranny of social opinion. Right? He lived that, right? So it is true that social opinion does work for John Stuart Mill, but he also knows the dangers associated with it, and as I say, he experienced them, with Harriet Taylor, and of course then, with his father, his crazy education that his father imposed on him, and Jeremy Bentham. Imagine what it would be like. How many of you have cracked open Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy, and read it, chapter by first 6 chapters and so on. One of the hardest works you'll ever read if you're a historian of economics. And he read it in manuscript, and he would walk around the garden with his father, and he would recite the chapter, that he had read, and tell his father, James, what David Ricardo is arguing. This is a young person. So, yeah, I don't want to. As I said, I don't like to be someone who says everything is, because of how someone was brought up or whatever. He's an extraordinarily talented and fair person. So he reads everything, and he reads everything with a mind that is open to whether it might have something important to say to him. Where do you get that, that characteristic from? I don't know, but it's certainly true of how he reads things. And it makes him difficult to read if you read the principles, because he talks about this experiment, this experiment, and you think, well, like, can he really be in favor of all this stuff? And he's trying to be fair, and he's basically saying, convince me, like, what is the evidence? And if this works, then it's not like capitalism is, is with this elbowing and shoving and whatever is the only possible world we can imagine, and so he's open to imagining different possibilities. Yeah.
So I have two related questions. The first one is about like the proximity between Smith and Mill, and if you would say there is any reflection in any of them about relative instead of absolute poverty. I'm seeing a lot about absolute poverty. So, and then the second question is about Mill's exchange with Tocqueville on pauperism. So this new form of poverty that they're seeing in commercial industrial societies, and whether that you think had a way of changing the way Mill is thinking about poverty and the role of social reform.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so first, they mostly are talking about absolute, and in fact Smith, he has this interesting argument where he says, you need the ranks of society in order to have stability. And where do we draw our political leaders from? There are different ways we could think about choosing leaders, but it looks like inheritance is working pretty well, and it's created a kind of stable society. So let's go with that. And you don't see a lot in Smith that I can remember. I might be not remembering important passages now, but where he's talking about relative poverty. Now Mill, I think, does a little bit more, I think, in relative terms. So that elbowing and so on, that's relative, right? That's where people are trying to jump over other people, and they're kind of stamping down people in their attempt to move up a socioeconomic scale. So I think Mill, while he also is thinking of absolute poverty, he's got a sense of, now we're into the kind of coming democratic movement and just a real change in economic conditions and so on. And so I do think he's more willing to think in terms of relative, or he's being forced to think in terms of relative. What was your second question? Yeah, so both, so it's a huge problem, and there the caloric intake is really, is really important. So that's, absolute poverty, and poverty that doesn't allow people to have enough energy to do very much. And you have the reform of the Poor Laws coming after Smith, and kind of right as Mill is coming of age. And those Poor Laws and other institutions Mill would like to see become more important as a way to educate workers to be able to be ready for the vote, which is going to be greatly expanded in 1870. And so he's in favor of trade unions, for instance, as a sort of self-insuring mechanism, as a way of workers being able to learn about politics, as a way of them helping them save for really bad outcomes, and as a way of helping them understand what capitalism is all about. So understand that it's not necessarily a great idea to try to put your employers out of business, for instance, but learn by experience together as a bunch of workers in a cooperative or other arrangement, that this is the best way to attain the happiness you're seeking. Did that answer your question? Sort of?
Well, I think this will be the last one then, John.
Okay.
Yep.
You talked about Mill and his idea that people are equal.
Yes.
Did he believe that the differences between people, which are large, are entirely due to education and upbringing? In other words, did he think there's sort of natural geniuses or not? I mean, he was one.
Yes,
I
yes.
would say.
Yeah.
But what was his belief at that time?
Yeah, so,
Clearly people are different, right? So like I'm 5'1", and there's no incentive that's going to make me any taller. So there are
Identify as taller.
not going to work. So clearly people are different, but for the purposes of policy evaluation, I think he and Smith before him are determined to stay away from those physical differences and instead, focus on the opportunities available to people and making those opportunities more fulsome. If a short person can do as many things as a person who's 5'6", which I think of as tall, or 5'10", or 6, whatever. If there are things that I'm closed out of because of my height, he would want those barriers removed. So yeah, I can go try out for the WNBA. I'm not going to succeed, but at least I can try out. So those kinds of barriers he would want to be removed. And then I want to go back to education, because it's a positive step, and giving the vote and having people have economic choices and so on, because those are positive steps as opposed to simply removing barriers. He would want to have the state provide opportunities for me to have basketball lessons in grade school or whatever, to have a phys ed class where I could at least learn how to make a layup and whatever. But in terms of does he know that there are some natural differences? He can look around himself as well as anyone else can, but he's not going to want the government or intellectuals, public intellectuals or economists, to impute natural differences as the cause for this economic calamity or that one. Does that sort of answer your question?
Well, it's interesting if he admits that such differences exist, and at the same time says they have no effect.
Well,
that's a little odd.
So they don't exist in this sense. It's not that people, say in Ireland or people in Canada where I'm from, have a different motivation to get ahead, right? We want to get ahead in Canada just as much as we do in the United States. Now, whether we actually do or not is going to be determined not just by our interest in, trying to improve our lot in life, but also by all the customs and arrangements that exist in Canada relative to the United States. So, for the purposes of economic and political decision making, we're basically the same, he says, right? We do have these physical differences, that mean that I can only run so fast and someone can only jump so high and, whatever. But those physical differences don't really actually enter in much to the marketplace, right? A little bit, but, not that. I mean, we all think about the superstar, the World Series and so on. Like, they're clearly physical machines who are, like, somehow I just think of them as are they really human? To hit a ball that's traveling as fast as they hit them and so on. And so, they matter, but only in very narrow circumstances throughout the entire economy. And for the most part, we're inclined to get ahead, to save our money, to spend our money, to work, and so on. And he says those motivations are the same no matter where we're from.